Dad's face turned white as he stared at the FBI badge flashing in Agent Torres' hand. "Are you telling me Sarah found what we think she found?" he whispered, his voice barely audible across the mahogany conference table. My sister Jessica dropped her legal brief, papers scattering across the polished floor. David's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering against his chair. They all turned to look at me, sitting there in my dirt-stained overalls and work boots, still smelling like the Ohio soil I'd been digging in just hours before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For 3 years, they'd called me the family disappointment, the daughter who threw away her MBA to play in the dirt on Mom's worthless old farm. They had no idea that the worthless dirt had just made me the most important person in the room, and that what I'd unearthed would change everything we thought we knew about our family forever. I wasn't always the daughter who made FBI agents show up at family meetings. 3 years ago, I was Sarah Mitchell, the middle child who never quite fit the mold my parents had carefully crafted for their children. Growing up in the pristine suburbs of Columbus, Ohio meant manicured lawns, country club memberships, and dinner conversations that revolved around stock portfolios and corporate ladder climbing. My father Robert ran a successful consulting firm downtown, the kind of place where suits cost more than most people's monthly rent. My mother Maggie had inherited the old farm in Millbrook County from her grandmother, but she'd sealed it up tight after marrying Dad, trading overalls for pearls, and never looking back. Jessica, my older sister, was everything my parents dreamed of in a firstborn. Valedictorian, law review editor, partner track at the most prestigious firm in the city. She wore her success like designer armor, sharp and gleaming. David, my younger brother, followed the family script perfectly too. Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs internship, and a corner office view before his 30th birthday. Then there was me, standing in the middle of their achievements like a weed in a rose garden. While my siblings collected degrees and accolades, I collected dirt under my fingernails. Even as a kid, I was the one sneaking into the neighbor's vegetable garden, fascinated by how tiny seeds could transform into something that nourished people. I'd spend hours watching cooking shows, not for the glamour, but to understand how fresh ingredients could become something magical. At 12, I started a small herb garden in our backyard, much to my mother's dismay. She'd watch me from the kitchen window, shaking her head as I carefully tended to basil and thyme plants that seemed to thrive under my attention. Mom never talked about the farm she'd inherited, but sometimes I'd catch her staring out at our perfectly landscaped yard, with a distant look in her eyes, like she was seeing something else entirely. When I asked about her childhood, she'd change the subject quickly, steering the conversation back to my grades or college applications. The farm was a closed chapter, locked away like an embarrassing family secret. By the time I hit high school, the divide between me and the rest of the family was impossible to ignore. While Jessica practiced closing arguments and David analyzed market trends, I volunteered at the local community garden, teaching elderly residents how to grow their own vegetables. My hands were always dirty, my clothes always smelled like compost, and my parents always looked slightly embarrassed when I walked into their social gatherings. The breaking point came during my senior year when I announced I wanted to study sustainable agriculture instead of business or law. The silence at our dinner table was deafening. Dad set down his fork with the precision of a man delivering bad news to a client. "Sarah," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "that's not a career. That's a hobby that will leave you broke and forgotten." Jessica leaned back in her chair, smirking. "What are you going to do, grow carrots for a living?" "This isn't the 1800s, Sarah. Smart people don't waste their lives playing in dirt." David just shook his head, already mentally writing me off as the family failure. But Mom surprised everyone. For the first time in years, she spoke up against Dad's judgment. "Let her explore it," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength I rarely heard from her. "There are things about farming you don't understand, Robert." Dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Looking back now, I think Mom saw something in my passion that reminded her of a part of herself she'd buried long ago. I went to Ohio State, majoring in agricultural science, while my family tolerated my choice with barely concealed disappointment. During breaks, I'd come home to find my achievements minimized, my future prospects questioned, and my passion treated like a phase I'd eventually outgrow. They measured success in salary figures and job titles, metrics that my chosen field rarely provided in the traditional sense. The real fracture came after graduation, when I turned down a corporate agricultural position with Monsanto to work at a small organic farm cooperative. The pay was terrible, the hours were brutal, and the work was exactly what my soul needed. But my family saw it as the final confirmation that I'd chosen mediocrity over excellence. "You're throwing away everything we invested in your education," Dad said during one particularly heated argument. "That degree was supposed to open doors, not lead you to a dead-end job that pays less than our housekeeper makes." Jessica was more direct. "You're embarrassing us, Sarah. Do you know what I tell my colleagues when they ask what my sister does? I make something up because the truth is too pathetic." David, ever the analyst, tried a different approach. "Look, I get that you want to help people or save the environment or whatever, but you can't change the world if you're broke. Come work with me for a few years, build up some capital, then pursue your farming thing as a side project." But I couldn't make them understand that this wasn't about money or status or even changing the world. This was about feeling connected to something real, something that mattered beyond profit margins and performance reviews. When I worked with plants, when I felt soil between my fingers, when I watched something grow from nothing into sustenance, I felt like I was doing what I was meant to do. The cooperative where I worked specialized in heritage varieties, plants that had been grown for generations before industrial agriculture took over. There was something profound about holding seeds that carried the genetic memory of hundreds of years, varieties that had fed families through wars and depressions and changing times. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tea became heritage tomatoes and herbs, plants that tasted like they remembered what food was supposed to be before it became a commodity. For 2 years, I threw myself into learning everything I could about sustainable farming, heritage seeds, and organic growing methods. I lived in a tiny apartment, drove a truck older than I was, and saved every penny I could. My family's disappointment became a constant background noise, like tinnitus I'd learned to ignore. They stopped inviting me to important events, stopped asking about my work, stopped pretending to be interested in my life. Then Mom got sick. It started with fatigue that she attributed to getting older, then came the doctor visits she tried to keep secret, then the diagnosis that changed everything. Pancreatic cancer, aggressive and unforgiving. Suddenly our family dynamic shifted, as we all struggled to process the reality that the woman who had held us together for decades was facing a battle she might not win. During her final months, Mom asked me to spend more time with her than my siblings. At first, I thought it was because my schedule was more flexible, but gradually I realized she had things she wanted to tell me, stories she'd never shared before. She talked about her grandmother's farm, about learning to grow vegetables and herbs that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. She told me about secret gardens and hidden seed collections, about knowledge that had been preserved through careful cultivation and quiet determination. "There are things buried on that farm, Sarah," she whispered during one of our last conversations, her voice weak but urgent. "Things your father never understood, things I should have shared with you years ago. Promise me you'll go there. Promise me you'll dig deeper than the surface." I thought she was talking metaphorically about family history and forgotten traditions. I had no idea she was being completely literal. Mom passed on a rainy Tuesday in October, leaving behind a grief that seemed to settle into our bones like winter cold. The funeral was everything she would have hated, formal and stiff, filled with business associates and social acquaintances who spoke in hushed tones about what a lovely woman she'd been. But I knew they'd never really known her, never seen the woman who'd once grown her own food and understood the language of growing things. The reading of the will was equally formal, taking place in Jessica's law office with everyone dressed in their professional armor. Dad inherited the house and most of the financial assets. Jessica and David received substantial trust funds that would secure their already comfortable futures. And I inherited the farm, 40 acres in Millbrook County, including the old farmhouse where Mom had grown up, the barn where her grandmother had stored seeds and tools, and fields that had been lying fallow for over 30 years. Everyone else saw it as the consolation prize, the worthless inheritance given to the family disappointment. Dad actually patted my shoulder with something that might have been sympathy. "At least you got something you can use," he said, as if he were comforting a child who'd received a broken toy. But I felt something different when the lawyer handed me those deeds. I felt like Mom had given me exactly what I needed. A chance to build something real on ground that carried the memory of women who'd understood what I was trying to do. The farm wasn't worthless, it was waiting. And I was finally ready to answer its call. The drive to Millbrook County took 2 hours through Ohio countryside that gradually shifted from suburban sprawl to genuine farmland. When I pulled into the long gravel driveway, my heart caught in my throat. The farmhouse stood like a patient guardian, weathered but solid, surrounded by fields that stretched toward a horizon painted in autumn colors. The barn leaned slightly to one side. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, but its bones looked strong. I spent that first day walking every inch of the property, trying to understand what Mom had left me. The house needed work but had good bones, with wide plank floors and windows that let in floods of natural light. The barn was filled with old equipment and tools, some dating back decades, all carefully maintained despite years of disuse. But it was the fields that called to me most strongly, 40 acres of rich Ohio soil that practically hummed with potential. That night, I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun set over land that was actually mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. I had no idea that in just a few months, this peaceful moment would seem like the calm before a storm that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my family, my inheritance, and myself. The next morning, I started digging. The first thing I found wasn't what changed everything, but it should have been my warning that this farm held secrets deeper than anyone imagined. 3 weeks into cleaning out the barn, I discovered a hidden compartment behind what looked like a solid wall panel. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades of Ohio humidity, were seed packets unlike anything I'd ever seen. Hand-labeled in my great-grandmother's careful script, varieties with names like Millbrook Memory Tomato and Pioneer's Promise Beans that didn't exist in any catalog I knew. But it was the journal tucked beneath the seeds that made my hands shake as I opened it. Page after page of meticulous notes about soil composition, planting phases tied to moon cycles, and growing techniques that seemed to combine science with something that felt almost mystical. My great-grandmother hadn't just been a farmer, she'd been a keeper of agricultural knowledge that went back generations, preserving varieties and methods that industrial farming had tried to erase. The journal entries spanned 40 years, documenting not just what to plant and when, but why certain combinations of herbs could heal specific ailments, how to read weather patterns in the behavior of plants, and most intriguingly, references to a seed vault that contained the real treasures that must be protected at all costs. Every mention of this vault was accompanied by cryptic references to a location where the old oak watches over 3 stones, and warnings that only family can be trusted with what lies beneath. I spent hours poring over those pages. This wasn't just farming. It was a form of agricultural artistry that treated plants as partners rather than products. The techniques she described could revolutionize organic growing, and the seed varieties she'd preserved could be worth a fortune to the right collectors. But finding the actual vault proved more challenging than deciphering her notes. The farm had 3 old oak trees, each massive enough to have been watching over the property for generations. I spent days digging around each one, following every possible interpretation of 3 stones, until my back ached and my hands were raw despite thick work gloves. Dad called twice during this period, both times asking when I was going to get serious about selling that place and doing something productive with your life. The breakthrough came on a Sunday morning in November, when the low autumn sun hit the property at just the right angle. Standing on the front porch with my second cup of coffee, I noticed how the shadows of the 3 oak trees created a triangle that pointed directly toward a small rise in the field I'd been ignoring. Walking out to investigate, I found 3 large stones arranged in a pattern that would have been invisible unless you were looking down from above, worn smooth by decades of weather but clearly placed with intention. The first few shovelfuls of dirt came up easy, too easy, like the soil had been disturbed more recently than the stones suggested. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that definitely wasn't a root. Clearing away the dirt with my hands, I uncovered the edge of what looked like a metal container, larger than I'd expected and surprisingly well preserved. It took another hour of careful digging to fully expose a military surplus ammunition box that had been wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof material and buried with the kind of precision that suggested someone had expected it to stay hidden for a very long time. Inside the box, my great-grandmother had created a time capsule that took my breath away. There were more seed packets, these labeled with varieties that I recognized from heirloom catalogs as being worth hundreds of dollars per packet. There were detailed growing guides written in multiple hands, suggesting that several generations of women had contributed to this collection. And there were photographs, dozens of them, showing the farm in its prime with crops I'd never seen growing in such abundance. But it was the documents at the bottom of the box that made me sit down hard in the dirt, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. Land deeds dating back to the 1800s, but not for this farm. These were deeds for properties across 3 states, all signed over to various members of my family, all connected to what appeared to be a network of farms that had been secretly preserving heirloom seeds and sharing them across the country. There were letters, too, correspondence between my great-grandmother and dozens of other women, all using coded language to discuss shipments and special deliveries, and protecting our heritage from those who would destroy it. The letters spanned decades, from the 1940s through the 1980s, and painted a picture of an underground network of farmers who had been working to preserve genetic diversity in crops, while the agricultural industry was pushing toward monoculture and chemical dependence. One letter, dated just 5 years before my great-grandmother's death, mentioned a final shipment that contained the crown jewels of our collection and would be, quote, buried with the deepest care until someone worthy could continue the work. The letter was signed by someone named Eleanor Hartwell, and the return address was a farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the heart of Amish country. But it was the last item in the box that made me realize I was holding something that went far beyond family history, or even valuable seeds. Wrapped in a piece of cloth that looked like it had been cut from a wedding dress was a small leather journal, and when I opened it, I found myself looking at what appeared to be a detailed record of financial transactions. Numbers that were too large to represent seed sales, dates that corresponded with major historical events, and most disturbing of all, lists of names that I recognized from history books. The journal documented payments that had been made to help people escape Nazi Germany in the 1940s, funding that had been provided to support civil rights workers in the 1960s, and contributions to environmental groups in the 1970s that had been fighting against chemical pesticides. My great-grandmother hadn't just been preserving seeds, she'd been using the network of farms to fund resistance movements and social justice causes for decades. The final entry in the journal was dated just 3 months before my great-grandmother's death, and it mentioned a final payment that had been made to ensure the safety of our most important cargo. The entry included coordinates that I recognized as being somewhere on the western edge of our property, near the old creek that formed the boundary line, along with a note that said, "Eleanor's final gift awaits the one who understands the true value of what we've protected." I sat in that hole I'd dug, surrounded by the evidence of a secret history that had been happening right under my family's noses for generations. My great-grandmother hadn't just been a farmer, she'd been part of an underground network that had been operating across the country for decades. The seeds were valuable, but they were just the cover story for something much larger. The coordinates led me to a spot where the creek had changed course over the years, leaving a small island of higher ground that was hidden by overgrown willow trees. The digging here was harder, with roots and rocks that made every shovelful a struggle. But I was driven by a curiosity that had completely consumed me. What I found, buried 4 feet down in a waterproof container that was much larger than the first one, changed everything I thought I knew about my inheritance and my family. Inside were stacks of documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Detailed records of a seed preservation network that had been operating across North America for over a century, moving genetic material between farms, universities, and research facilities in a coordinated effort to prevent the loss of agricultural diversity. There were correspondence with scientists, contracts with international conservation organizations, and financial records that showed millions of dollars had moved through this network over the decades. But there were also documents that made my blood run cold. Records of government surveillance, FBI investigations into suspicious agricultural activities, and reports that suggested federal agents had been monitoring the network for years without being able to prove any wrongdoing. There were photographs of people I didn't recognize, surveillance reports on network members, and most disturbing of all, a list of farms that had been compromised by government infiltration. The final set of documents explained why my great-grandmother had buried everything and why the network had gone underground. In the 1980s, new federal regulations had made it increasingly difficult to transport seeds across state lines without permits and inspections. The network had been branded as potentially dangerous, possibly connected to environmental terrorism or agricultural sabotage. Several members had been investigated, some arrested, and the entire operation had been forced to shut down to protect the people involved. My great-grandmother's final letter, addressed to whoever finds this and has the courage to continue our work, explained that she'd spent her final years destroying evidence and burying the most important materials to keep them safe from government seizure. She'd hoped that someday someone in the family would discover the truth and have the courage to resurrect the network, or at least preserve the seeds and knowledge that represented decades of careful work. But the letter also contained a warning that made my stomach clench with fear. She wrote that they never stopped watching, and that anyone who tried to continue the work would likely face the same government scrutiny that had destroyed the original network. She advised extreme caution, suggested finding trusted allies who understood the importance of genetic diversity, and warned that the value of what I'd found would make me a target for both government agencies and private interests who would want to control or destroy the collection. As I read those final words, sitting alone in a field with the sun setting behind me, I realized that I wasn't just the inheritor of a farm and some valuable seeds. I was now the keeper of a secret that people had died to protect, the guardian of genetic material that could be worth millions to the right buyer, and the target of investigations that had been going on since before I was born. The next morning, I drove back to Columbus with the second container locked in my truck, my mind racing with possibilities and fears. I needed advice, but I couldn't risk talking to anyone who might not understand the delicate nature of what I'd discovered. The documents had made it clear that the wrong word to the wrong person could bring federal attention that I wasn't prepared to handle. I spent 3 days researching Eleanor Hartwell, the woman whose name appeared throughout the correspondence, and finally found an obituary from a Lancaster County newspaper dated just 2 years ago. She'd been described as a, quote, private individual who dedicated her life to agricultural preservation, and the obituary mentioned that she'd been survived by a daughter who continued to operate the family farm. It also mentioned that Eleanor had been a, quote, passionate advocate for heirloom varieties and traditional farming methods. The daughter's name was Ruth Hartwell, and it took me another 2 days to work up the courage to call her. When I finally did, explaining that I'd inherited my great-grandmother's farm and found some documents that mentioned Eleanor, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What was your great-grandmother's name?" Ruth asked quietly. "Margaret Sullivan, but everyone called her Maggie. She married into the Mitchell family." Another silence. Then Ruth's voice came back stronger. "Maggie Sullivan. She was one of the founding mothers. We've been waiting for someone from her family to make contact for over 20 years. Founding mothers of what? The Heritage Seed Alliance. Your great-grandmother was one of the original coordinators. She saved more genetic material than anyone else in the network, and when everything went underground, we lost contact with her completely. We always hoped that someone in her family would eventually discover the truth and reach out." Ruth explained that a small group of the original network members had continued working quietly over the years, maintaining seed collections and sharing materials through carefully managed channels. They developed new methods for avoiding government attention, established legal frameworks for their work, and built relationships with universities and conservation organizations that provided legitimate cover for their activities. "But we never had access to your great-grandmother's collection," Ruth continued. "She was the keeper of some of the rarest varieties, seeds that we thought were lost forever when the network was compromised. If you've found her vault, you're holding genetic material that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture." I told Ruth about some of what I'd found, carefully avoiding the more sensitive documents, until I could better understand who I was dealing with. She listened with the enthusiasm of someone who truly understood the value of what I'd discovered, asking detailed questions about specific varieties and growing conditions that proved she was legitimate. "There's something else," I said finally. Documents that suggest the government was investigating the network. Are we still at risk? Ruth's laugh was dry. Honey, they never stopped investigating. But times have changed. What we were doing in secret 40 years ago is now considered cutting-edge conservation work. The climate crisis has made genetic diversity a national security issue. The same government agencies that once hunted us are now funding projects just like what we were doing. She suggested that I reach out to Dr. Marcus Webb at Ohio State University, who ran a federally funded seed preservation program and had been quietly working with former network members for years. According to Ruth, Webb had the connections and credentials to help me legitimize my collection while protecting it from commercial exploitation. But she also warned me to be careful about who else I trusted with the information. There are private companies that would kill to get their hands on what you found, she said. Monsanto, Bayer, all the big agricultural corporations are desperately trying to monopolize genetic material. If they find out what you have, they'll either try to buy you out or destroy you legally. The next day, I called Dr. Webb's office at OSU, expecting to leave a voicemail and wait days for a callback. Instead, he answered personally and agreed to meet me that afternoon. When I arrived at his laboratory, I found a man in his 60s who looked like he'd spent equal time in libraries and farm fields, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he took his work very seriously. I showed him photographs of some of the seed packets I'd found, carefully selected examples that would demonstrate the value of the collection without revealing its full scope. His reaction was immediate and dramatic. He actually dropped the photographs and stared at me with an expression that was equal parts excitement and disbelief. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "Some of these varieties have been extinct for decades. This packet of Cherokee purple tomatoes is from a strain that we thought was completely lost. And this," he held up a photo of beans labeled in my great-grandmother's handwriting, "this is a variety that was developed by the Seneca tribe and hasn't been seen since the 1960s. Dr. Webb explained that the university had been working for years to rebuild collections of heritage varieties, but much of their work involved starting from compromised genetic material that had been mixed with commercial varieties over the years. What I'd found represented pure genetic lines that could be invaluable for both research and conservation. But this isn't just about the seeds," he continued, studying the photos more carefully. "The documentation you've described suggests your great-grandmother was part of something much larger. There were rumors for years about an underground network of seed savers, but we never had proof it existed." I told him about finding Eleanor Hartwell's letters and my conversation with her daughter Ruth. Dr. Webb nodded slowly, like pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in his mind. "I need to make some calls," he said finally. "There are people who need to know about this. People who can help protect what you found and ensure it's used for the right purposes. But I have to warn you, once this information gets out, your life is going to change dramatically." That night, I sat on the front porch of the farmhouse, looking out over fields that suddenly felt charged with history and possibility. In just a few weeks, I'd gone from being the family disappointment playing in dirt to being the guardian of genetic material that could help feed the world. But I'd also become the keeper of secrets that powerful people had killed to protect, and I was starting to realize that the peaceful life I'd imagined for myself was about to become much more complicated. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Dr. Webb, and his voice carried an urgency that made my heart race. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. I've been making calls about your collection, and the response has been more intense than I expected. There are people who want to meet with you immediately, and some of them represent interests that might not have your best intentions at heart." "What kind of people?" "Government agencies, private corporations, and some individuals whose motivations aren't entirely clear. The word is spreading that someone has found a major heritage seed collection, and everyone wants to know who and where." My mouth went dry. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" "I'm saying you need to be very careful about who you trust and what information you share. The collection you've inherited isn't just valuable, it's strategically important. In the wrong hands, it could be used to control food production in ways that would hurt millions of people." Dr. Webb suggested that I consider moving the most valuable materials to a secure location while we figured out the best way to handle the situation. He also recommended that I contact a lawyer who specialized in agricultural intellectual property, someone who could help protect my rights while ensuring the seeds were used for legitimate conservation purposes. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that my problems went beyond protecting seeds or avoiding corporate exploitation. Somewhere in those documents I'd found were records that could expose decades of government surveillance and illegal investigations. If the wrong people found out what I knew, I could become a target for reasons that had nothing to do with agriculture. The next morning, I woke up to find tire tracks in my driveway that hadn't been there the night before, and a small recording device stuck to the underside of my truck that was definitely not something I'd put there myself. Finding that recording device changed everything about how I understood my situation. I stared at the small black box in my palm, no bigger than a matchbook, but sophisticated enough to transmit everything I'd been saying near my truck for who knows how long. Someone had been listening to my conversations with Dr. Webb, my calls to Ruth Hartwell, and probably my discussions with myself as I tried to process what I'd discovered. The peaceful inheritance I thought I'd received had turned into something that made me a target for surveillance I didn't understand. Instead of panicking, I felt something unexpected surge through me. Determination. Growing up, I'd always been the Mitchell child who asked too many questions, who dug too deep into subjects that made adults uncomfortable, who refused to accept simple answers to complex problems. Now, faced with evidence that powerful people wanted to control what I'd found, that same stubborn curiosity that had driven my family crazy was exactly what I needed. I drove the recording device to an electronics repair shop in Columbus, where a technician who looked like he'd rather be working on vintage guitars than surveillance equipment confirmed my suspicions. The device was professional grade, the kind used by law enforcement or private security firms, and it had been actively transmitting for at least a week. Someone with serious resources had been monitoring my activities since shortly after I'd started making calls about the seed collection. But instead of discouraging me, this discovery ignited something that had been building since I first opened my great-grandmother's journal. These seeds weren't just valuable plants. They represented knowledge and genetic diversity that had been carefully preserved by women who understood that controlling food meant controlling people. The same forces that had driven the network underground in the 1980s were still operating, still trying to monopolize agricultural resources, still treating genetic material as a commodity to be hoarded, rather than a heritage to be shared. I called Drive Webb from a payphone outside a gas station, feeling ridiculous but not wanting to risk further surveillance. When I told him about the recording device, there was a long silence before he spoke. "This confirms what I was afraid of," he said quietly. "There are interests involved here that go way beyond academic research or conservation work. You need to understand that what you've inherited could be worth tens of millions of dollars to the right buyer, but it could also be seen as a threat to companies that have invested billions in controlling seed markets." He explained that in the decades since my great-grandmother's network had gone underground, the agricultural industry had become increasingly consolidated. A handful of corporations now controlled the majority of commercial seeds, and they'd been systematically buying up or destroying heritage varieties that might compete with their genetically modified products. What I'd found represented exactly the kind of genetic diversity that these companies had spent fortunes trying to eliminate. "But there's something else you need to know," Dr. Webb continued. "The government agencies that once hunted seed savers are now some of their biggest supporters. Climate change has made genetic diversity a national security issue. The same FBI that investigated your great-grandmother's network is now funding projects to preserve exactly what she was protecting." This revelation hit me like a physical blow. The people surveilling me might not be enemies trying to steal my inheritance. They might be federal agents trying to protect a resource they considered vital to national interests. But that possibility raised even more disturbing questions about my autonomy and rights as the legitimate heir to this collection. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about modern seed politics, agricultural consolidation, and government involvement in genetic preservation. What I discovered was a world of competing interests that made my head spin. Environmental groups fighting to preserve biodiversity, corporations trying to patent genetic material, government agencies balancing security concerns with property rights, and farmers caught in the middle of battles they barely understood. The more I learned, the more I realized that my great-grandmother's decision to bury the collection had been brilliant. By keeping the seeds hidden for decades, She'd protected them from corporate acquisition and government seizure, while allowing the political landscape to shift in favor of preservation rather than control. Now, with climate change making headlines and food security becoming a global concern, her collection could be revealed as a conservation triumph rather than a suspicious underground operation. But I also understood that revealing the collection properly would require navigating a complex web of legal, political, and commercial interests. One wrong move could result in everything being seized by federal agencies, stolen by corporate interests, or destroyed by people who saw genetic diversity as a threat to their business models. Ruth Hartwell called me the next morning, her voice tight with concern. Dr. Webb told me about the surveillance device. We need to meet in person, somewhere safe, where we can talk without being monitored. We arranged to meet at a farmer's market in Lancaster County, where Ruth's presence would seem natural, and my interest in heirloom varieties would appear casual. The drive to Pennsylvania gave me time to think about how drastically my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, my biggest concern had been whether I could afford to repair the barn roof. Now I was planning clandestine meetings to discuss genetic material that might be worth more than my family's entire net worth. Ruth was easy to spot at the market, a woman in her 50s with calloused hands and sharp eyes, who examined produce with the intensity of someone who understood plants at a molecular level. We walked through the stalls, speaking quietly while pretending to shop for vegetables, and she filled in details about the Heritage Seed Alliance that made my situation even more complex. Your great-grandmother wasn't just a member of our network, Ruth explained, handling a perfect heirloom tomato while she spoke. She was one of the founders. One of the women who organized the whole system back in the 1940s. She had connections to seed savers across 3 continents, and her collection includes varieties that came from places that no longer exist. She told me about seeds that had been smuggled out of countries during wars, varieties that had been rescued from areas that were later destroyed by development or climate change, and genetic material that represented the work of indigenous farmers whose knowledge had been passed down for thousands of years. My great-grandmother hadn't just been preserving plants, she'd been safeguarding cultural heritage and genetic resources that couldn't be replaced if they were lost. But here's what makes your situation so dangerous, Ruth continued, lowering her voice as we moved away from other shoppers. There are people who know exactly what your great-grandmother had, and they've been waiting decades for someone to find it. Some of them want to preserve it, some want to profit from it, and some want to destroy it because it threatens their business interests. She explained that corporate seed companies had been systematically acquiring heritage varieties, not to preserve them, but to patent key genetic traits and then prevent anyone else from using them. Once a company owned the patent on a particular genetic sequence, they could sue farmers who saved seeds, or researchers who tried to breed new varieties using traditional methods. That's why the surveillance started so quickly, Ruth said. Word travels fast in our community when someone finds a major collection, but it also travels fast in corporate circles and government agencies. Everyone wants to know what you have and what you plan to do with it. As we talked, I began to understand that my inheritance came with responsibilities that went far beyond my own financial interests. The seeds I'd found represented genetic diversity that could help feed the world as climate change made traditional agriculture increasingly difficult. But they also represented knowledge and cultural heritage that belonged to communities and peoples who had developed these varieties over centuries. What would my great-grandmother have wanted me to do? I asked Ruth as we sat on a bench outside the market, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a farming community that still valued traditional knowledge. Ruth smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth I'd seen from her. She would have wanted you to be smart, careful, and true to the values that drove her to preserve these seeds in the first place. She believed that genetic diversity belonged to everyone, not just to whoever had enough money to buy it or enough power to control it. She suggested that I consider partnering with a coalition of universities, conservation organizations, and farmer groups that had been working to create seed libraries and preservation programs across the country. This approach would allow me to maintain control over the collection while ensuring it was used for legitimate conservation and research purposes rather than commercial exploitation. But she also warned me that going public with the collection would make me a target for intensified corporate and government pressure. Once everyone knows what you have, you'll never have a quiet life again, she said. Are you prepared for that? Driving home through the Pennsylvania countryside, I thought about Ruth's question and realized that I'd been asking myself the wrong thing. Instead of worrying about whether I was prepared for the attention and pressure that would come with revealing the collection, I should have been asking whether I was prepared to honor the trust my great-grandmother had placed in me. She hadn't buried those seeds because she wanted someone in the family to get rich or famous. She'd hidden them because she understood that genetic diversity was too important to leave in the hands of people who valued profit over preservation. Now that responsibility had fallen to me, and I had to decide whether I was brave enough to accept it. The next morning, I called Dr. Webb and told him I was ready to move forward with revealing the collection, but only under conditions that would protect both the seeds and the communities that had developed them. He connected me with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a lawyer who specialized in indigenous rights and agricultural intellectual property, who explained how we could structure the revelation to maximize protection while minimizing the risk of corporate acquisition or government seizure. The key, Dr. Vasquez explained during our first phone conversation, is to establish legal frameworks that recognize the cultural and historical significance of these varieties before anyone can claim ownership based purely on possession or discovery. We need to document the provenance of each variety and ensure that the communities that developed them maintain some control over how they're used. This approach would require extensive research into the origins of each seed variety, collaboration with indigenous groups and farming communities, and careful coordination with universities and conservation organizations. It would also require going public in a way that generated enough attention to make the collection politically difficult to seize, while building enough legal protection to prevent corporate exploitation. But I have to warn you, Dr. Vasquez continued, this process will take years and will require resources you probably don't have. Are you prepared for that level of commitment? I looked out the window of the farmhouse at fields that had been waiting 30 years for someone to understand their true purpose, and I realized that commitment had never been my problem. I'd spent my entire adult life pursuing goals that other people thought were worthless or impossible. Now I had the chance to do something that could actually make a difference in the world, even if it meant sacrificing the quiet farming life I'd originally envisioned. Yes, I told Dr. Vasquez, I'm prepared. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that being prepared for the legal and logistical challenges was only part of what lay ahead. I still had to figure out how to tell my family that their disappointing daughter had inherited something that would make her either very rich or very famous, and possibly both. And I had to do it in a way that protected them from the attention and pressure that would inevitably follow. The first test of my resolve came sooner than I expected. That afternoon, a black sedan with government plates pulled into my driveway, and two people in expensive suits got out and walked toward my front door with the confidence of individuals who were used to getting whatever they wanted. It was time to find out exactly who had been watching me, and what they wanted with my great-grandmother's legacy. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.